Hello and welcome, everyone. My name is Bruce Barnum from CCLP, and it's my pleasure to welcome you and be your host this evening for the fourth iteration in our series of Policy Forum events. This evening's event is on tax credits, and we've got a very interesting program coming up for you. I'm going to say a little bit more about that with live simultaneous interpretation. And thanks once again to Community Language Co-op and to Liz in particular for providing that for us this evening. We really appreciate it, and we always appreciate when everybody can participate in the event in the language of their heart. That's one of our goals here with our events at CCLP, and we're glad to be able to deliver that through thick, thin, and technical difficulties. So for this evening, we have a three-part event for you. First of all, we're going to have a mini presentation by our own Charlie Brennan. Then we're going to move on to a short panel discussion. We've got a few policy experts and aficionados on the call with us this evening that are going to hop on for that portion. And we're going to have some facilitated questions for those panelists that will expand on the topic of tax credits. And then we're going to move on to the final segment, which is the part that we're most excited about, which is the time that you get to participate with us in this conversation. So when we get to that portion, you'll actually be able to speak up and share your stories, your lived experiences, and your questions with CCLP and with the panel of policy folks that we've assembled this evening, and have a real community conversation about tax credits, which we're very excited to hear and to be able to share with you this evening. So, but you don't have to wait for that portion. So if you have questions that arise while you're watching the mini presentation from Charlie, or that come up while you're watching the panel, you can go ahead and put those in the Q&A box, which you will also find in the lower right-hand portion of your screen at any time during the presentation. And one of our esteemed colleagues here at CCLP will be keeping track of all those questions, and we'll be able to get to those in the community participation section. Plus, if you want, when we get to that part, we can unmute you. If you raise your hand in the participant area, we'll be able to unmute you, and you'll be able to actually speak directly to the panelists and ask your question or make your comment at that time. So really looking forward to all of your participation and engagement in this event. So now on to today's topic. Today's Policy Forum is about tax credits in Colorado. But these aren't the big corporate loopholes and giveaways to the rich that you might be thinking of when you usually hear tax credits. No, these are about tax credits that empower people in the community to benefit directly. So one of CCLP's 4 policy focus areas is income. And one way that people facing income insecurity in Colorado can have enough income is to benefit from our tax code. Therefore, tilting the tax system in favor of folks in need has long been a focus of CCLP's advocacy and policy agenda. And this year, we're eager to share that we've made great progress on that front with some big changes to that tax code that will benefit people who need it most and level the playing field a little bit. So you're about to hear about all that important policy work and advocacy that happened in the legislative session and beyond, and what it means for you and your community from all of those policy experts and aficionados gathered here today. So without further ado, we're going to move to the first item on our agenda, which is a short presentation from our own Charlie Brennan. I've been pleased to call Charlie my colleague here at CCLP for more than half a decade. Currently, Charlie serves as our Director of Income and Housing Policy. And Charlie, originally from Utah, since joining CCLP, has turned his background in urban and regional planning into a large body of policy and research expertise in these 2 important topic areas for CCLP. So with that, Charlie, I'm going to hand it over to you to talk about tax credits. Take it away.
Great. Thank you, Bruce. And thank you, everyone, for joining us this evening. Again, my name is Charles Brennan. I use he, him pronouns, and I'm the Director of Income and Housing Policy for the Colorado Center on Law and Policy. So with that out of the way, introductions, let's dive into this brief presentation and get the event started here. Oops. Sorry. So at their most basic level, tax credits are available to you when you file your taxes with either the federal or the state government. And they work by essentially reducing the amount of income tax that you owe to either the state or the federal government. That's a very simplistic definition, and we'll get into some more details here in the following slides. So there's 2 different types of tax credits, largely 2 different types of tax credits here in this conversation. There's refundable tax credits and non-refundable tax credits. Refundable tax credits are ones that allow you to keep the difference between the amount of taxes that you owe and the amount of tax credit that you're eligible for. So for example, if you owed $500 to the IRS in your federal taxes, but also qualified for a $1,000 tax credit, not only would you not owe anything to the IRS, but you would also get the remaining $500 of that tax credit as a tax refund as part of your tax refund. On the other hand, non-refundable tax credits are ones in which the taxpayer does not receive that difference. While they don't receive that difference, on the other hand, they don't owe any taxes, and so it can still be beneficial to many taxpayers. That said, non-refundable tax credits typically don't provide as much assistance to low-income households because many low-income households earn incomes that are too low to require them to pay any taxes, or they don't owe any taxes to either the state or the IRS, and so don't necessarily benefit from the additional sort of refundability that happens with refundable tax credits. So sort of getting that extra money back on their tax refund. So as I mentioned, there are numerous tax credits available here in Colorado for taxpayers to claim, both from the federal government and from the state government. And these are tax credits that you can claim as many of these as long as you're eligible for and meet those eligibility requirements. And so, can stack on one another and really sort of magnify magnify the impact that they have on household economic security. So at the federal level, we have the Earned Income Tax Credit, or the EITC. I'll be using that acronym a lot because that's what we typically refer to it as. It's a little bit easier and quicker to say than Earned Income Tax Credit. The Child Tax Credit, or the CTC, is another tax credit. And then Child Independent Care Tax Credit is another sort of big tax credit that's available from the federal government when you file your federal taxes as a Colorado resident. In addition to that, we also have tax credits available at the state level. And many of these mirror the federal tax credits, so should look fairly familiar in terms of their names. There's the Colorado Child Tax Credit, the Colorado Earned Income Tax Credit, and starting next year, that was created this year by the legislature, the Family Affordability Tax Credit, which will provide even more assistance and really sort of boost the assistance that's currently available to households with kids through the EITC and the Child Tax Credit here at the state level. And I'll also note that at least for these state tax credits, these are available to folks without a work-eligible Social Security number, so long as they have an ITIN or an individual tax identification number. And really quickly, although it's not a tax credit, I did just want to plug another sort of reason to file your taxes in Colorado is that for many tax filers, this is the main way that they can claim their TABOR refunds in years where there are TABOR refunds. So potentially even more assistance available to households when they file their taxes in addition to these tax credits. So just another plug to the importance of filing your taxes here in Colorado, because even though you might not owe anything to the state, you may be eligible for some funds back from the state. And so to sort of really highlight the ways in which tax credits assist households and the ways that they can provide assistance, I thought it'd be helpful to quickly run through sort of a simplified sort of analysis of someone's taxes that they might owe, depending on their filing status and if they have kids. So in that first column on the left shows the taxes owed for a single filer with no kids who earns $47,500. And then the other column to compare a joint filer with one kid that also earns a similar amount. And so single filer and joint filer are different tax statuses that folks have depending on their family composition. And in general, our tax code tends to be more or provide more assistance, more benefits to joint filers than to single filers, as we can kind of see as we can compare these two different columns in the way that the tax code sort of treats the income of these various taxpayers. We can see much more much higher standard deduction for the joint filers, different tax brackets that go up higher. And where we can really see this difference is in the tax liability. So here we can see at the top of the table that a single filer who has, at similar levels of income would owe $3,800 in taxes before tax credits, compared to the joint filer, that has one kid who would owe around $2,000 in tax credits. Now the single filer, because they don't have kids and because their income is too high, they would not qualify in this scenario or this example for either the EITC or the child tax credit, and so end up owing the federal government $3,800. On the other hand, the joint filer, who before owed around $2,000, qualifies for both the EITC and the child tax credit because they have a kid, and sees their taxes owed change from owing the government $2,000 or around $2,000 to actually getting back close to $900 in their tax refunds as a result of these refundable tax credits. And, I think it's helpful for, at least for me, I'm a visual person, to see sort of how these tax credits look in terms of the credit amount that different taxpayers are eligible for at different income levels. And so here on this first slide, we can see sort of the different tax credits amounts that are available to different income levels for the federal and the state earned income tax credit. In Colorado, at least for this coming tax year, our earned income tax credit at the state level is a percentage match of the federal tax credit and would be around 50% of the federal credit this year, although that may change in future years depending on revenue collections as we move forward here from 2025. We can see that the EITC sort of has what's called a trapezoid design. And so essentially, you're not eligible for the full credit amount until you reach a certain income level. So our lowest income taxpayers actually aren't able to claim the full credit amount that is available to higher income taxpayers. This is largely due to the design, or it's intentional in the federal EITC, and is intended to encourage work, although there's not super strong evidence that suggests that there is a strong link between the earned income tax credit amounts that folks earn and their willingness or their chances of being in the workforce or being employed. On the other hand, we can see the state and federal child tax credit. You can see the federal child tax credit in the solid lines, the solid darker lines, sort of follows a similar design to the earned income tax credit. And that was the case for our state tax credit here in Colorado until next year. Thanks to legislation passed last year, our child tax credit starting in tax year 2025, or starting in 2025 for income earned in 2024 will reflect this new sort of structure or design. You can see it's very different from the federal credit in that the full credit amount goes to the lowest income taxpayers with step downs in the credit amount that folks are eligible for as their incomes increase. So no sort of, intention of encouraging work through this design of the child tax credit. Our family affordability tax credit will also, follow a similar design of the child tax credit, in which our lowest income taxpayers are also eligible for the full credit amount, with the credit amount decreasing as incomes increase. And so I think if you've been looking at sort of the numbers too on the left-hand side of the slide in terms of the amounts that folks are eligible for and sort of been adding them up in your head, I think, it's easy to see how, when you add up all of these different tax credits that folks might be eligible for, plus, that they're available at the federal level and the state level, it results in potentially quite a bit of assistance to low-income households to support their economic security. That said, there are some drawbacks to tax credits. Before we do that, let's just an overview of those tax credit designs, right? So we can talk about different ways that we can target assistance to people based on their incomes, either by setting whatever the maximum income requirement is, or through decisions similar to sort of the family affordability tax credit versus our earned income tax credit to decide whether or not to target the full credit amount towards the lowest income taxpayers or have that benefit increase as incomes increase. Additionally, other considerations when we're thinking about tax credit policy, at least for these working tax credits that benefit working families, is sort of whether or not they're available to folks with or without Social Security numbers, whether they're available to folks of certain ages, and as well whether or not they're available to households with or without children, and even within that for children of certain ages, right? So our family affordability tax credit, when that is available next year, will provide various levels of support depending both on the age of the child as well as the family's income. And then ultimately, the amount of the tax credit is very important, as well as whether that tax credit amount is refundable or non-refundable. And so some barriers and challenges that we see sort of facing folks as they go to try to claim or get these tax credits, right? So I think, you know, they're only as effective as long as folks are claiming them. And we know that many Coloradans who are eligible for these tax credits don't claim them each year. So for instance, 22% of Coloradans in 2021 did not claim the federal EITC, so likely also probably didn't claim the state EITC that year either. The federal tax credits, unlike our state tax credits, are also only available to folks with a work-eligible Social Security number, and so that further limits the accessibility of these tax credits to folks who might not have you know, the right immigration status to be able to claim them. In addition, as I mentioned before, many of the federal tax credits are designed to encourage work, which can limit the availability of the full tax credit and limit the effectiveness or the assistance that it provides to low-income households by cutting out those lowest income taxpayers from the full credit amount. As well, you know, many of our tax credits, as you'll have noted, are really designed to support families with children and don't provide much support to single adult households without kids. And that wraps up our brief presentation. So now I want to turn it over to our panel discussion and question and answer. So before we do that, I'm going to briefly introduce our panelists and then ask them to further introduce themselves by way of responding to my first question. So joining us on the panel, we have Shar Robert, the Emeritus Advisor for the Colorado Center on Law and Policy. Also have Caroline Nutter, the Legislative Coordinator from the Colorado Fiscal Institute, as well as Isabel Dixon, the Economic Mobility Program Manager with the Colorado Department of Public Health and Environment. So welcome to you all, and thank you for joining us today. First question for you, and also part of our introduction here is, you know, it'd be great to learn a little bit about your work, your organization, and why either you personally or your organization has an interest in tax credits for working families like the Colorado EITC and the child tax credit. And I'll ask Shar to go first, just because she's the first on my screen. So Shar, take it away.
Thank you, Charlie. I'm Shar Robert, Emeritus Advisor, and I first got involved with state tax credits in 1999. And that actually was before I came to work at CCLP. I was chair of the Women's Lobby. And in 1999, we worked with the then executive director of CCLP to establish a state earned income tax credit in Colorado. When I came to CCLP in 2013, I then added in work on the low income child care tax credit and worked on a number of versions of that bill since they tended to expire very quickly. And then in more recent years have also worked on the 2023 child tax credit. In terms of why I have gotten involved with tax credits, there's a whole lot to say, but I'll just say that I really believe in the value of cash for individuals. It helps them really set their own priorities and is more versatile in terms of meeting whatever priority they are feeling most. And also as a matter of fairness, that if we are going to be discussing tax breaks, that part of what should be on the table is tax breaks for struggling families. And I'll leave it at that.
Thank you. Caroline, do you want to go next?
Sure. Thanks so much. It's so great to be on a panel with Shar and Isabel. What wonderful companions up here. The Colorado Fiscal Institute, where I work, we're a nonprofit, nonpartisan research and advocacy organization. If you haven't heard of us, we really focus on tax and budget policy, both in our research and our advocacy. And as the legislative coordinator, I am responsible for most of our work down at the Capitol. At CFI, we really care about the EITC and the CTC because we know how effective refundable tax credits like them really are. They're really one of the best anti-poverty tools we have, and I'm just excited to be on this panel to talk about them a little bit more.
Great, thank you. And Isabel, to you.
Yeah, thank you. Also thrilled to be here. As Charlie said, I'm Isabel Dixon. Economic Mobility Manager at the Colorado Department of Public Health and Environment, otherwise known as CDPHE. Our program partners with public health, human services, and early childhood programs and community-based organizations at the state and local level. And what we try to do is connect more Coloradans to resources to improve their financial well-being and hence their health. So why is the health department interested in people's economic status? It's really because poverty is a social determinant of health, meaning it's a root cause of inequitable poor health outcomes, as many of you may be aware. And we know that increasing financial well-being improves mental and physical health, long-term health outcomes, educational outcomes. And we know that tax credits specifically are associated with lower infant mortality, fewer incidents of low birth weight, less child maltreatment and engagement with the child welfare system, and increased food security and educational and earnings outcomes. And so we administer a bilingual campaign called Get Ahead Colorado, Hacia Adelante Colorado, to help get the word out about tax credits and free filing. And the campaign connects people to accurate information about why they should file, where they can file, tries to build trust in doing that. And we also support programs to refer to free tax filing and tax information. So Colorado's tax code is now one of the most progressive in the nation, but people need to know about that, and they need to know how and where to file and where they can get free help, and they need to feel safe in doing so and to feel trust in doing so, because many are not aware that they're eligible for tax credits or how to do it for free, and they don't feel comfortable doing so. So tax credits are really supportive policy, part of a supportive policy landscape for families, similar to childcare, paid leave, food and nutrition programs for people. And we really feel that tax credits can be an important part of benefits referral. So I'm super excited to be part of the conversation.
Great. Yeah, thank you. And I just added a link to Get Ahead Colorado to the chat. It's a fantastic site and many great resources and in multiple languages. So definitely encourage folks to take a look at the resources there to learn more and get more information about tax credits here in the state. And Isabel just added it in Spanish. Thank you, Isabel, as well as a link to the partner toolkit, which provides more information for folks on these tax credits. So thank you all for that introduction, and great to have you all here with us. It sounds like from hearing Chart, tax credits have been on the books here in Colorado for a number of years, but it seems like only recently that they've been sort of a big focus and in the news of policymakers here in the state. Why do you think we've seen so much action on tax credits in recent years when we haven't really before? And that can go to anybody, whoever wants to take it.
I can jump in real quick, if that's all
Please.
right. Yeah, I feel like the reason is sort of twofold. I think both have to do with Tabor. Because we are pretty limited by Tabor, for those of you that don't know the Taxpayers' Bill of Rights, it's one of our constitutional restraints when it comes to tax policy. It limits our revenue and our spending and the types of taxes that we can implement in the state and legislators' abilities to vote on taxes. But raising any revenue for tax credits, raising any revenue for just general policy is a really difficult thing to do in Colorado. And so I think for people to achieve policy goals in environmental, educational, or even housing spaces, it's easier to pass a tax credit than to fund a new program. And so I think that's one big reason. But then I think the other reason, which also has to do with Tabor, is because we've had such big Tabor surpluses in the last 5 years. Or in the last 4 years. So for those of you that are not familiar, we have a cap on our revenue in this state because of Tabor. And if we raise revenue over that cap, we have to return the money to taxpayers. But one of the ways you can return the money to taxpayers and spend down the surplus is to implement tax credits. And so there are lots of different tax credits that people have spent the Tabor surplus on in the last few years, ranging from film tax credit incentives, job tax credit incentives, and of course, the EITC and the CTC and the FATC, which is what we're on the call to talk about today.
Well, I'll second the first two things that Carolyn said. I would also add that in the last maybe 10 years, our legislators have become a great deal more sophisticated when it comes to understanding the tax credit piece. I used to laugh when legislators would propose an idea and you'd go, well, there's not money for that. And they'd go, oh, let's make it a tax credit, as if that was absolutely free money. And as of the last few years, I think we've understood that it's sort of kind of a yin and yang thing, that if you, the more you pull into tax credits, the less money you have in the general fund, and creating new tax credits or reducing income tax rates shrink that pot of money that is above the Tabor limit. The third reason I would add is related to fairness. And even in 1999, Colorado had, it was like the first year that really the amount of the surplus had taken off, and Colorado had 900 million above the cap, the spending cap. And so immediately all corporate lobbyists came up with a good reason why their client should get the Tabor refund as their own tax break. And there also was a big movement to reduce the state income tax rate from the 5%. And that went through. And there was a feeling, not only among CCLP, but among some other legislators, that it was only fair, since cutting the income tax rate only helps those who have income high enough to owe income tax. And in fact, it helps most those who have the most income, that should be balanced with some kind of tax provision for very low income people. And I think we saw that same dynamic play out last year, where, you know, when people were saying, let's just cut the, you know, there's too much money coming in, so let's just cut the income tax, and that helps everybody. And it's like, no, it actually doesn't help everybody. And so things like the family affordability tax credit could help balance the tax cut that really disproportionately, or most of the benefit is going to people the higher their income is.
Totally agree, and the detail is really helpful in understanding how we got here. Also, just to add on, that there have been partners working on this for so long that we're kind of standing on the shoulders of giants, with CCLP and Gary and Colorado Fiscal Institute being in this space. And then with the expansion of the 2021 federal child tax credit, we had some data to also turn up some excitement around this and see the impact that it, depending on how you look at it, lifted 40 to 50% of children in poverty out of poverty. And we could also see how families were spending their credits, and counteract that narrative that sometimes comes up that, you know, the money's not being spent responsibly or something like that. But we could see it was spent from census data on school-related expenses, food, and childcare. So I think this gave a lot of behind some of the new expansions.
Great, yeah, thank you, Isabel. That's a helpful reminder that we've sort of seen what a sort of expanded child tax credit and the impact it can have at the federal level when that was available through the American Rescue Plan Act back in 2021. So, you know, seems like there's been a lot going on over, you know, both in recent years and sort of, you know, in past years to support tax credits here in the state. From your all's perspective, what do you think has been the biggest win for this movement over the past few years? Or what gets you the most excited? Or what are you feeling the most you know, accomplished about having achieved here when it comes to tax credits? And anyone can go first, whoever wants to take that one first.
Well, I'll go first.
Okay.
EITC is my sentimental favorite, although I really would have an honorable mention for the child tax credit restructuring that really addresses some of the deep poverty among people who are making, you know, below 15,000 a year, below the 2,000 a year. And I'm really proud that, number one, it got restructured in a progressive manner so that, again, the lower your income, the higher your tax credit on that one, and that there is no sunset on it. Having suffered having a sunset on the EITC and missing out on it for over a decade, the fact that it doesn't have a sunset on it and is permanent is a big win.
Great. Yeah. And for folks who don't know, a sunset is sort of a piece of, written into the legislation, but sort of had an end-by date or an expiration date for the legislation. So yeah, that's great that's no longer part of that tax credit.
I'll say, oh, sorry, Isabel, you can go ahead.
Briefly, super excited about the family affordability tax credit and the potential it represents, and that programs are really jumping in at the local level with the tailored outreach and trusted voices, all the way up to the state programs, folding tax outreach into their benefits referral processes. And I think it can all just potentially really coalesce to connect people to resources that can support their health.
Absolutely. I'll say, I feel like the first sort of major expansion that we did in the last 5 years in 2021, our big tax bill that expanded the EITC and fully funded the CTC for the first time in its history in Colorado. I think that bill really opened the door to a lot of these changes and started to make the things that we were asking for sound so reasonable. Since we had already kind of like shoved our way in there a little bit. So yeah.
No, thank you for that. Yeah, no, lots of great wins, lots of things to be excited about for tax credits over the last couple of years. But as we've been talking about and mentioned earlier, these are only effective so long as folks are aware of them and are, able to claim them. And we do know that, not all who are eligible for these tax credits do claim these tax credits. Given that, why, in your opinions, maybe one or two reasons why, I know that there's many reasons why that is, and some, ways that we can help address the challenges or barriers that folks might face when it comes to accessing these tax credits.
I can jump in there. It's hard to just name one or two reasons, but we do know that complexity is such a barrier for people. And so connecting them to free, simple, trusted resources, whether that is our wonderful partners at volunteer income tax assistance sites or VITA sites, or programs who are already talking with families and know them, have their trust, can connect them in the language of their heart to tax resources. We know that trust is a huge issue in engaging with the IRS, the Department of Revenue, the government in general. Language barriers, so the more language expansion we can do around our outreach, the better. The fear of owing money can often be a barrier. We know oftentimes new parents and caregivers, including grandparent caregivers, are not aware that they're eligible for the child tax credit, for example. And it's just very complex. It's a lot to keep up with, even for those of us who think about it a lot. And the administrative burden is high for busy families. We're working multiple jobs. And so we just want to simplify.
I do feel like some of the people who are the most likely to get missed is somebody who is not already filing taxes. I know I used to file taxes early on just to get the over withholding back. That was motive enough to go file taxes. But people don't have to file taxes if their income is too low to owe taxes. And that's sort of kind of the very folks that could benefit by some of these taxes. So if you have like a head of household who's earning $20,000 a year, that person doesn't have to file taxes. There's no requirement because their income is below the standard deduction. I feel like if people actually connect with somebody who does taxes, that with the different tax, automated programs, somebody's going to ask, do you have kids and what are their ages? And that, even though the system's complex, if they're working with somebody who is working with a software program that's asking the right questions, that they're much more likely to end up with a good refund. And people are very motivated to go. I mean, this is for so many people the biggest check they're going to see all year. And especially after they go through one tax season with a kid, they're definitely coming back the next tax season, because it's really that chance for some very significant and life-changing amount of money.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, no, quite a bit available through these tax credits potentially for many families. So that's great. We talked a lot about sort of where we've come and sort of what we've achieved in this tax credits here in Colorado. I'm curious, what do you all, or from your perspective, what do you think are the future for tax credits here in the state? Sort of where do we go from here? Is there anything that we as advocates, supporters, or recipients of these tax credits should be looking out for in the next couple of years? I'm thinking things like the expiration of the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act at the federal level next year, and what impact that might have. But I know that's sort of a big question, so feel free to just take a bite of it if that makes sense. But yeah, just curious to sort of see or to know more about what you guys sort of see coming down the pike here as it relates to tax credits.
I can jump in with that. I think fiscal reform and revenue generation is just really going to need to be kind of top of mind for especially advocates and organizers in this space in the next few years. We're going to be entering into tight budget land again. We are not going to have the surpluses that we've seen in the last 5 years, maybe ever again. I think that was very, very unprecedented. And I think that it can't just be revenue. We really need to make big changes to Tabor to ensure that we're not just chasing revenue year after year in expensive ballot campaigns. We can't do that and fight defensive fights on these tax credits, because we just don't have the capacity as a movement to do both of those things. And I think defensive fights on these credits are going to be happening in the next 5 years, just because of what our budget looks like. So I think just kind of banding together around fiscal reform, big revenue fiscal reform changes is kind of what I hope the future of tax credits looks like. Just because I think that we've kind of gotten everything we can from the current fiscal environment, and especially under Tabor. I think we've sort of sucked that dry a little bit.
I'm going to mention one little thing, which is congressional action on the Tax Cut and Jobs Act, which it reminded me so much of state level activity, in that a lot of the permanent changes went to things that benefit people with higher incomes and to corporations at the federal level. And I know working at the state level, it seemed like, like the very initial cut in the income tax rate in 1999 was a permanent tax cut, whereas the EITC was contingent on there being a Tabor surplus, and therefore it was on the books but never got paid. And likewise, Congress, when they did the Tax Cut and Job Act, they could only do so many permanent things, because like a 10-year projection had to balance out. But they made sure that the corporate tax breaks were permanent. And so what's going to be argued over is whether to renew the tax cuts for individuals. And we did see the tax rate on the lowest income people go down under the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, and the increase in the standard deduction, and some good things there. And it will be interesting to see that play out under whoever will be in charge of the Congress, et cetera, next year. But you're talking about billions of dollars, trillions, actually.
Any
Always
hopes for?
interesting watching the congressional activities. Sorry, Charlie, go ahead.
No, I was just going to say, any hopes for an expanded permanent child tax credit in the coming years, do we think? Hopefully.
I think we'll see how the election plays out.
Sorry, Isabel, go ahead.
No, it's fine. Yeah, I think we need to just keep an eye on direct file. And so the IRS's rollout of a simplified filing portal that connects you directly to filing without using a third-party software. And some of the other pilots of simplified filing that are going to be coming out in Colorado, just to keep an eye on those processes and how they can bring more people and non-filers into the tax system will be very interesting.
Yes, it'll be nice to have a free way to easily file taxes here in Colorado and at the federal level. I'm so excited for that when it's available. Great. Well, and we're sort of nearing the end here of the panel discussion. So I just wanted to wrap up with a final question. What's one thing, if there is something, that you'd like everyone to know about tax credits that we haven't covered so far in our discussion? And maybe there's not anything and we can get into the questions and things will come up then, but
I can jump in. The tax code, federal and state tax code obviously changes year to year. It's a lot to keep up with, but the message is really simple and doesn't change, which is just file, ask folks in your communities or that you're connected to through your work, did you file? And just we can all play a part in getting the word out to our families and in our communities and in our work.
Great. Well, I want to thank our panel for joining us and for this great discussion. We really appreciate it and the expertise that you provided to us all this evening. Now I'd like to open it up to our participants, folks attending the event, for any questions for our panelists or other comments or questions or anything else that you'd like to share around the earned income tax credit, child tax credit, or any of the other tax credits we talked about today.
Yeah, thanks for that, Charlie, and our entire panel. What a fascinating set of information you've presented here in the last few minutes. I think we're all learning something new tonight, which is wonderful. And now that we have reached the community forum portion of the evening's event, we would like to invite anybody in the audience who would like to go ahead and participate. And there's two main ways you can do that. First of which is to give us a written question in the Q&A box. And our friend Katie has been collecting those as we've gone along. So we do have a few questions already. So we can start with those, but go ahead and take your additional thoughts, questions, stories, really anything you'd like to share, and you can put them in that question and answer box in writing. Or because this is an open forum, we also have the option, which is a little more fun, we think. So we encourage you to do this if you'd like to. Just go to the participant area in Zoom, which is another one of those buttons at the bottom of your screen. And you should be able to raise your hand. So you just put your hand up and one of us here on this end who are hosting the event can unmute you and you can speak directly into the event. So this is a place where you can share your voice if you would like to. So definitely go ahead and raise those hands and we will call on you in a minute or type your question. And in the meantime, I'll start with those questions that we already took from the audience earlier on in the event. So the first one of those for Charlie and the entire panel. This is going to be probably a good one for whoever wants to explain this one. Please explain adjusted gross income. Question comes from EB. So AGI, what is it? What does it mean?
Charlie, you or me?
Yeah, either way, you go for it, Caroline. You're the expert here.
Yeah, so your adjusted gross income is basically just what your total income is minus any deductions that you have. So you take your gross salary basically that you get paid on, and then you just adjust your income with any deductions that you plan on taking. So either the standard deduction, which is what most people take these days now that it's been doubled, or itemized deductions if you have a lot of expenses that qualify for itemized deductions that makes more financial sense for you to take the itemized deductions instead of standard deductions. That's what your adjusted gross income is.
Excellent. Thank you for clearing that up, and feel free, anybody, to ask a follow-up question if there's anything more you'd like to hear about that. But otherwise, we'll move on to the second question that we have for you. And that one is, can you explain, and then in quotes, reducing state income tax liability for pensions, proposed legislation for next session? So this is about a potential bill, it sounds like, for next session, as an anonymous questioner. So I can't ask for more details yet, but if somebody asks this question and you want to pop up, just raise your hand and we can unmute you. But then the rest of the question is, can you detail whether this could help para-retirees who largely don't receive Social Security? Does anybody feel ready to answer
I'm
that?
going to weigh in on half of that. I don't follow para per se, but in the last, I think it was maybe 2 years ago, we changed from like 5 years ago, if you were over 65, if you were 65 or older, you could deduct off your income $25,000 worth of retirement income, so that not all of your pension or Social Security would be taxed. And then a couple years ago, maybe 3 years ago, there was a bill to make a provision in a bill. It was the governor's insertion into, I can't remember if it was the EITC bill or another bill, to say that all Social Security should not be taxed. And so in the last, I think year of tax filing, maybe 2 years of tax filing, 0% of like whatever if you're getting whatever 30,000 in Social Security, then you can take that 30,000 off your total income and not have to pay state taxes on that difference. The feds are still taxing Social Security either to a certain percent, up to 85%. And I think the thing about tax credits is that whenever you cut a tax credit for one person, somebody else goes, well, if you're doing that, why not cut, why not make Social Security taxes for people between 55 and 65 not taxable? And I think we did that this year. And so I'm guessing it's about the para-retirees who are saying, well, wait a minute, if you're not taxing Social Security, if you're able to, at the state level, should we look at doing the same thing for para? But I'm not, I have not followed para, but that's my guess, is because we give tax breaks to seniors like myself.
I think that's a pretty good guess, fair to say, Shar. So thank you for tackling that one. Anybody else have more to share about the para aspect? Otherwise, I'll move on to the next one. All right, so the next one is about the Colorado Child Care Tax Credit. So question just asked, what about the Colorado Child Care Contribution Tax Credit? Is that still available? And I think Charlie talked a little bit about this in the presentation, but if you want to expand on what's happened with that particular tax credit and how that interacts with those other tax credits, I think this would be a good moment for that.
Yeah, actually, I'll let Shar take that one because I didn't do this one yet. So this is yet another tax credit that we have here at the state. And so I'll let Shar take that one. Again, you can kind of see how we sort of use tax credits a lot in our sort of policymaking here at the state to achieve different goals.
Yeah, at the moment we have what I think the requester is referring to is the Child Care Contribution Tax Credit. And that is a tax credit for donating to a child care center. So I refer to it as the donor tax credit. It doesn't go to the parents. It goes to a donor who gives a certain amount of money to, and I think it's 50 cents on the dollar, that if you give like $100 to a local child care center, you get $50 off your taxes, which is a really good deal for a donor. And it's very popular among people who are donors, who often are the same people who donate to political campaigns. That's one tax credit. We also, and it gets confused all the time with the child care tax credit. And then there is also one that we worked on, the low income child care tax credit. And those last two are a tax credit for parents. And in this year's EITC bill, it sets up for those two parent-based tax credits to be merged into one credit, just a teeny bit larger, but to get rid of, there were some cliff effects in moving from the low income child and care tax credit to the regular one. And it's because the traditional, the older child care tax credit was based on a percentage of the federal child care tax credit. And the federal child care tax credit is not refundable. So even if you're paying money for child care, you may not be able to claim the federal credit if you make too little money. And again, below that standard deduction, because you won't have a liability to pay federal taxes. So that's why we created the low income one, which was refundable. And it's hard to say it with a straight face. When we're talking about child care tax credits, like the low income child care tax credit, parents could get 1/4 of child care expenses up to $500 per year in their tax refund. And, you know, there's a lot of parents paying that per week. And even the regular child care tax credit and the federal one, it's like depending on your income, it can be like $600, $400. I mean, it makes a dent, but really probably is equal to maybe 2 weeks of childcare, somewhere in there. So I don't know if that helped at all or just made it most confusing. And the other thing that's confusing is legislators and normal people confuse the names all the time. And so they're often referring to the wrong thing. In 2026, it will take on the same name as the federal credit, which is Child and Dependent Care Credit, which includes caring for elder care, or maybe you're taking care of a sister who's an adult that lives in your home that you're supporting, etc. So let's see, we have a question. Next year, we will not have, for tax year 2026, you file for in the beginning of 2027. And so the CTC, this is another example of how easy it is to get the names mixed up. CTC usually refers to the child tax credit, which is just having a child. Child care tax credit refers to getting a little refund on what you're paying for somebody to be taking care of your child. So the child tax credit is alive and well. It will be in a different, more progressive form next year. The child and I think the family affordability, I think that's a year off, right? I'm thinking.
It starts next year.
Yeah.
Probably
And then the year after that is when the change in the merging the low income child care tax credit and the child care tax credit. And you don't necessarily have to know all of this, but whoever's helping you with your taxes or your software should pick up on all this.
Yeah, I think safe to say that's very confusing for a lot of folks.
Normal people, yes.
It's everyone, the overlap in those names is very confusing indeed, which is unfortunate. But I think that was some very helpful clarification. We did have a follow-up question from the same poster who asked that original question, and they clarified that they are referring to the donor tax credit, which you call donor tax credit, so that contribution to a child care center and you receive the 50 cents on a dollar tax credit back, very generous tax credit for those donations. They say they read something about the eligibility of that program moving forward for that donor one. And I don't know if that's been a big focus for us, the donor tax credit. We're probably more focused on the other tax credits. So I don't know if anybody knows the answer to that question offhand about that child care donation tax credit to child care centers, if that's changing or not. We might have to research that one a little bit and get back to you, because that's out of that whole package. That's, I'm assuming, the one that we've probably worked the least on, because it's not really anti-poverty or low income connected in the same way.
All I
I don't
would say
believe
is
that one
it's a
is
much larger credit. It's a really big credit and it's been growing. And so when they renew it, that's sort of the pushback is it growing too fast? On the other hand, donors usually have a good pipeline to legislators to emphasize the benefit, because this helps childcare centers keep their doors open or to add programs or sustain programs.
Carolyn, were you gonna weigh in there too as well?
I was just going to say that the childcare contribution credit is was sort of re-upped in 2023 and will continue you know, until they repeal it.
Excellent. Good clarification. All right, now that we've waded through all of the similarly named child tax credits, hopefully that's been helpful a little bit. I know that helped my understanding actually of all of the different permutations of those. We have a question that is probably somewhat related, and this is a question I've had for a long time. So this is a question, says if the federal government has all of our taxable income information already through W-2s, 1099s, and so forth, and when you file taxes incorrectly, they come back and tell you you're wrong, then why don't they just figure this out at a federal level and send us a bill or a check? In other words, why doesn't the government, fill out the tax return on behalf of the taxpayer and send it to them rather than making that incumbent on the taxpayer to do all of that work and then find out if they got it right or not? Why is this on us? And they clarified also that that does apply to both federal and state taxes, but especially for federal. So that's I think a question I've asked or heard asked many times. Does anybody want to speak on that one a little bit?
Well, I can give kind of a cynical answer maybe to that, in which case I would say, a lot of it has to do with the fact that the tax preparation business is a very big and lucrative business. And so for a long time, their lobbyists have been able to make it so that the IRS is not able to create a free tax filing software, because you're right, they have all of the information that they should need to know to understand how much we owe them in taxes. So it shouldn't really be on us and to get it right when they already know. And so I think that's where a program like Direct File is really important and really sort of, I think, game changing here in terms of setting up a system that is freely available for folks to use to be able to file their taxes in a little bit more of an easy way. Although I definitely hear you in that there's probably a lot of improvements that could be made still in terms of how we file taxes here in the US and in Colorado to make it even more easy. It certainly, is possible and is done in other countries. So we know that there's models out there that we can follow. It's just kind of I think a big honking behemoth to kind of wrangle and make any sort of significant changes to, unfortunately. But I'd be interested to hear what others have to say as well.
Will Direct File have autofill of that information the questioner is referring to?
I believe so.
Once Colorado moves to the Direct File, or the states that currently have that, will it autofill some of the information it already has?
That's a good question. I'm not sure. I believe so, but I would hope so, because that would make it really easy. So I hope that's part of it. Let me see.
All right, we'll circle back when Charlie's had a chance to check on that, it looks like. In the meantime, we'll go to another question. Just a quick reminder before we do that. If you want to come on and speak to the panelists, you have that option. So if you want to raise your hand, we're happy to unmute you as well for a question. But if not, we'll move on to the next written question. Just a reminder, you can do that though. So Charlie mentioned that there was very little data showing the effectiveness of incentivizing work income in the tax credit policy process. So how is the decision made? How is the decision made to make this a part of the tax code justified? And is there anything that advocates can do to bust this myth? So really zeroing in on that work income incentivization in tax credits.
Yeah, no,
Thank you.
that's a great question. Go ahead. No, sorry, Carolyn. Go ahead. Sorry.
Oh, okay.
Didn't mean to cut you off there.
So I know, I think I will say that I know that for particularly single working mothers, there is evidence to show that the EITC is something of a work incentive. That study was done like a few, I think like 10 or 20 years ago. But I think Charlie's right that for most of the people that are receiving the EITC, it is not a huge work incentive because usually there are already two working parents in the household anyway. I will say that for a really long time, the EITC was actually a bipartisan policy. Even in Colorado in 1999 and 2013, it was passed on in a bipartisan way. And so I think the work incentive piece of the EITC has been one of the cornerstones of why it has been bipartisan. I think that as tax conversations grow more and more partisan and we see a bigger and bigger divide just about even supporting programs that Republicans had supported in the past, I think that some of the things that had been a part of those programs sort of maybe to incentivize the other side of the aisle to support those programs, maybe they can be taken out. But I think on the federal level, we might be waiting a long time for something like that to happen.
Yeah, no, that's exactly right. I do think it's for the bipartisan appeal of having sort of a work requirement in there, and for a while, it was a policy at the federal level, at least, that had been expanded under both Republican and Democratic presidents or administrations. So I think that was definitely a strong selling point in terms of proponents at the federal level for including those kinds of designs or sort of the incentive for work into the design of the tax credit.
Yeah, I would mention in 1999, in Colorado, we had a Republican governor, Republican House, and Republican Senate that passed the first EITC bill. And in fact, Governor Owens in his State of the Union called for, because there was already people clamoring for a reduction in the income tax rate and the sales tax rate, and a tax break for Excel and a tax break for bull semen, and just anything you could think of, people thought they should get a tax credit for. But I think it became really quickly apparent that if they use this 900 million just to do corporate tax breaks, that would not reflect well upon them. Even though there was pressure, certainly a lot of lobbyists were working to try to get corporate tax breaks. But I think it was evident to Governor Owens that that just didn't smell right, and that there was balance required. And so he specifically said he wanted a EITC bill that was sponsored by Gary McPherson, that was the head of the Republican head of the Finance Committee. More recently, it has been harder, but I remember Representative Mark Clower out of Colorado Springs, Republican, when he could talk about how he got the EITC as a young teacher, that really can make a difference. And particularly in the rural areas, people may not be aware that the rural areas have a higher percentage of people who earn at an income level, because their wages tend to be lower in rural areas. A lot of times they can more readily qualify for some of these tax credits than people in other parts of the state. And so there are people of both parties who get these credits. It kind of depends on the income level, and it would be encouraging to see more discussion and people talking about how this may have helped them in a previous stage in their life. We give these tax credits particularly for people with young children. And when you think about parents of young children, they're more likely to be just in the beginning years of their career, when their pay is often much lower than it might be once they're in their 50s or 40s and 50s. And so I have often referred to it as a sort of lifetime approach where people need help at different points in their life, particularly when they're just starting families or when they're just starting, into a career, and they may not need it, 4 or 5 years from then.
Yeah, and just to follow up quickly on the last part of the question around what advocates might do to help bust this myth. I think as Isabel mentioned, there's a lot of great data and research that came out of the temporary expansion of the child tax credit in 2021 that provides a lot of good information and data that I think can help dispel some of these myths that folks have around work and incentives to work, and providing folks with sort of unrestricted cash and sort of how that affects incentives to work, that I think really sort of do show that folks don't stop working just because they start receiving a child tax credit or even the full amount of the child tax credit, that really there's a lot of other things that that determine or drive folks' decisions around work that really don't necessarily rely solely on whether or not they'll receive the full tax credit amount or not. And so I think using or looking back to sort of past times when we've expanded either the child tax credit or the EITC. I know a lot of research has been done on the EITC in other states when states have expanded it to try to determine whether what sort of employment effects that might have had in terms of reducing employment or not. And oftentimes those studies are sort of mixed or find little to no impacts on employment when it comes to expanding those tax credits. So I think really lifting up those stories and sort of what the data really says to help dispel those myths, because really there isn't really anything, I don't think, definitively or strongly in the data that really supports this idea that we can't give the lowest income folks in our state the full tax credit amount because they won't want to work.
Just to tag onto that, Charlie, you can't really talk about incentivizing work without talking about childcare, the cost of childcare. So as some of these expansions in Colorado and federally that are proposed take hold, maybe there'll be more data to show us how these different policies are impacting families and rates of work.
That's great. Thank you all for that extensive answer to that extensive question. That was a lot of great content right there. Really appreciate that. I do have another question for you, and this is a compare and contrast, so always a fun one. How does Colorado compare to other states in regard to how we provide tax credits to people in need versus how we provide tax credits for people who are wealthy or corporate interests?
I think that's a really interesting question, and I will come on and just plug for people's to remind everyone, not in a tax credit sense, but just comparing just generally tax breaks, because tax credits and especially refundable tax credits tend to be for very specific purposes like the EITC or the CTC. And so a lot of times when we think about the tax breaks that rich people and corporations are getting, we're thinking of tax deductions, which are not as effective as tax credits in that tax deductions only reduce your taxable income. They don't give you directly money back. But for someone who has a lot of taxable income, tax deductions are very effective at reducing your tax bill. However, luckily, in 2022, voters passed Proposition FF in Colorado, which funded our Healthy School Meals program. But it was actually, not only did it do that, but it also had the sort of sneaky tax component to fund it, that basically reduced the ability of anyone making over $300,000 a year to itemize their taxes, which is kind of where a lot of people who have really big tax bills or people who make more money, that's where they are really able to get a lot out of the tax system, is through itemizing their deductions. And so by really constraining the ability of people making over $300,000 to itemize their deductions, Prop FF actually was sort of a fair tax policy, as much as a healthy school meals policy. I know that for businesses and corporations, the tax code is a little bit different and has sort of its own, they have their own breaks and deductions and credits that they get. So I don't really know how we compare to other states in that regard, but I know that we did in 2022 enact this tax policy that made our tax code a little bit more fair by removing some of those breaks for wealthier parents.
I would mention the one statistic I remember, which was when the 2023 restructuring of the child tax credit was signed. Jane Institute out of New York, JAIN, that follows a lot of these tax credits, said that at that time, so that's like June of 23, that when it goes into effect, which it's going to soon here, that tax credit of $1,200 for parents earning under 25,000 a year was the second largest in the nation. But I do think there may have been another state since then that did something as well. But at that time, we were the second largest in terms of especially the low income, the size of the lowest income, their child tax credit of the $1,200 each was the second highest in the nation.
Yeah, and I'll just add too, I think when we look at sort of the current design of a lot of our tax credits, they do feature or include features that we don't see in every state that has a state version of the CTC or the EITC. I'll just note too that not every state has a state version of those tax credits, and so we're sort of unique in that sense there. But I think we're also unique in the sense that both of those tax credits that are available at the state level are refundable, and that's not the case in every state. As well, our state tax credits are available to those without work-eligible Social Security numbers, which is not true of the federal credits, and it's also not true of many other states. And so I think, in certain senses, we do have features included in our tax credits in the tax code here in Colorado that, further, I think, help expand who is able to access these tax credits, as well as, make them more effective in terms of the assistance that they provide to low-income households through being refundable, for instance.
Yeah, and it strikes me that another way to think of that question or ask that question would be how progressive is our tax code here in Colorado, with tax credits and also beyond tax credits. And so, of course, that has to do with Tabor that's been mentioned a few times this evening, but also has to do with things like the flat tax provision of Tabor, which I think is, not the part folks usually focus on, but something that's, required in terms of our income tax, and also some of those income tax cuts that we've had go through the ballot in recent years, and I believe we have another one coming up. And combine that with the property tax equation in the state. I wonder if any of you have thoughts about that, sort of the overall progressiveness of the tax environment in Colorado, either in general or compared to other states.
Well, I know that we're one of only a few states that have a flat tax. Most states have a graduated income tax, which we are explicitly banned from doing in Tabor, as you mentioned. And we also have bans on other kinds of taxes that tend to be more progressive. So we have bans on real estate transfer taxes. We have bans on statewide property taxes. And it really leads us to rely pretty heavily on our sales tax to get a lot of things done. I know that in Denver this year, there are two new sales tax measures that would, I think, bring our Denver sales tax up to like 9.6% or something like that. And we know that sales taxes are regressive, meaning that they fall heaviest on lower income people. And so I think that overall, in terms of like how we're doing in our tax code, I do think that our tax code is pretty regressive. And that's mainly, I think, because we can't have a graduated, or we don't have a graduated income tax.
Yeah, and I'll just add that we do know, though, that tax credits like the EITC help to make our tax code more progressive. And so, but for those tax credits in our tax code, we would have a much more regressive tax system than we do now. So, I think, well, while, we are limited by Tabor, I think, us and other groups like CFI have taken lots of steps to ensure that, even with the restrictions that we face, we're still trying to address sort of the imbalances that creates in our tax code in terms of who pays. And I'll just make a quick plug for a national group who has a lot of data and information on this. The Institute on Taxation and Economic Policy produces a report called Who Pays that provides some really interesting graphs and charts. I'm a visual person, so I love graphs and charts of sort of the amount of income that folks at different income levels pay in taxes, both state and local taxes. So not just income taxes, but looking at the full range of taxes. And we see, very clearly, the areas where, for instance, sales tax, where, there's a lot more regressivity in our tax code than we see in other states. And you can see this for Colorado as well as compare Colorado to other states as well. So definitely encourage folks to take a look at that. It's some interesting data and information about the various states' tax codes and how progressive those are.
I do want to respond to Carol's comment.
Yeah, please.
And we actually did change the tax code within the last couple of years to not tax Social Security at all for first of all, for 65 plus. And then there was a newer bill that I do believe passed this year for 55 plus. The federal government does still tax Social Security, but the state used to, but just in the last couple years, we no longer tax Social Security. Well, you get either seniors get the 65 and older, you get 25,000 in retirement income that's not taxable. Although now that we're making all of Social Security not taxable, if your Social Security is higher than that 25,000, you have the option to take that higher figure on Social Security. So you can't like take the 25,000 in pension and have Social Security not taxed. But we did recently change that at a state level.
That's great. Good update, Shar, I think.
Well,
So
I know they had
probably-
incorrect information on their map in like the latest AARP or something. And I go, that's no fair. We changed that. So I think they were looking back a couple years when they did their map, if that was what you were looking at. But yeah, take a look at the tax form, either from this past year or coming up, and see if it doesn't align with that.
Excellent. Thanks for that clarification, Shar. Oh, Carol has raised her hand, so I'm going to unmute you, Carol. You can pop in. Go ahead and speak.
Well, I just reread all of this stuff because of this new bill that is being proposed, and it does appear there's a ton of complexity around Social Security, various income levels and so forth. So it's very, very complicated. Cher, I could not figure out that. I know for a fact, because I testified on the bill this last session, that was income based. So it was not all 55 to 64-year-olds. And you're right. If you look online, there's mixed messages. It's not clear, but there's a new bill, and they're apparently trying to again redo the taxation at the state level of Social Security in various income bands.
At the state level, maybe if what passed is means tested. Is that correct?
Yes, I believe that it has continued to be means tested, 65 and over, 55 to 64, and now there's a new bill that's being proposed that's much more complex, all kinds of new different income levels. Don't know that it'll, even get introduced in that form, but. And I agree with you. The AARP site seems to have conflicting information to the state Department of Revenue. Thanks.
Excellent. Well, thank you so much, Carol. We appreciate you hopping on to weigh in on that one. It sounds like it's probably something we need to do a little bit of tax education around, which I know is something that everybody on our panel here is very concerned with as well, making sure the public has good information about the complexities of our tax code, of which there are a great many. So that was the last question that we had in the hopper here to take care of. So if nobody else in the audience wants to hop in or ask a question, I give kind of a last call. But otherwise, we're going to go ahead and wrap up. We're about at the end time of our event anyway, so that worked out very, very well. Oh, Katie's telling me there's one question. Oh, who is sponsoring the new bill? Evie asked. Yeah, Evie asked who is sponsoring that new bill. I think maybe you were asking Carol. And I don't know if Carol, if you know who was sponsoring that bill, the proposed bill that you were referring to.
I can't, I don't know how to talk. So
You're speaking, Carol. Go ahead.
oh, okay. I see no sponsor identified with the draft language. I don't know that the draft language is for public consumption, but I'm interested too in who's sponsoring it.
Yeah, was this past year Holtorf, Representative Holtorf? Am I
Yep, it
remembering
was.
that right?
Yep, that's
Okay.
right.
Yeah, we didn't take I don't think we took a position on that. It's a little out of our scope.
All right. Sounds like we're all curious, but nobody knows. So we'll do a little bit of looking into that. But yeah, thanks for that final question there, Katie. All right. Well, with that, I think we're going to wrap up tonight's policy forum. So first, I want to thank everybody on the panel for your participation. A lot of tremendous information that we heard from all of you this evening. So we really appreciate your time and your expertise in these matters. And then especially want to thank our audience for the many excellent questions that we had to take us through this community conversation piece in particular. And thanks for joining us and for weighing in. It was a very interesting conversation. And for folks who weren't able to be in our audience this evening, we are recording this event. So we will give us a little bit of time to do some post-production editing on the event, and then we will post it on our YouTube channel, which has been our practice with all of our past events that are recordable. So you can go there and see a lot of other great content on other topics that CCLP has covered in policy forums across the past couple of years, and some other great events as well. So keep an eye out for that. And then I know our communications team here will be working on an event recap as well. So that'll end up posted on our website after a few days or a couple of weeks. And I encourage you all who were here, if you think of somebody who would have been really interested in this information and couldn't be here, go ahead and share those resources with them. We definitely want to get that out in the community. And then while you're on our website, we strongly encourage you to scroll down to the bottom and sign up for our newsletter. I think that's one of the best ways that you can stay engaged and informed with CCLP's work throughout the year. So when it comes to the legislative session and also beyond, we put a lot of great content in that newsletter each and every single month. So a great resource for you and completely free of charge and accessible. So encourage you to do that, and then stay tuned as well within that newsletter and on our website for future events. And in particular, I'd call attention to our next upcoming scheduled event, which is Communities Against Poverty. And that's coming up on December 12th this year. And it's a great live in-person event at History Center, Colorado. Over the lunch hour, we're going to have a nationally renowned speaker joining us, Dr. Virginia Eubanks from SUNY Albany, and she's going to be talking about her recent award-winning book about artificial intelligence and poverty. So something that I know is on the tip of awareness for everybody who's working in the policy space here in Colorado, and for folks out there in the public, is how is AI and algorithms going to impact what we all pay in rent, what we all pay in consumer prices, and the impact on poverty in general. So definitely watch out for that event to be going live soon, and register and join us in December. We'd love to see you there. So with that, thanks to everybody. We're going to wrap up for the evening, but we really appreciate you being here, and we'll see you soon. Thank you so much.